Yeah. So if you switch from God as a hypothesis, inert and a tool for humans to use, and you switch to either hypothesis generation, like I generate all sorts of hypotheses. Some people generate really weird hypotheses that tend not to work so well. Other people just keep banging it time and time again and really, really getting good hypotheses and doing awesome things in reality. But hypotheses are still very passive. There's an agent that uses them and does things and changes reality rather than just conforming to reality. So now you have hypothesis generation and someone acting to try and conform reality to something it isn't currently like, at least in some respect. But then you can get a level more meta and create these packages of hypothesis creators and actors. And so if God is the creator of us, who are hypothesis generators on the one hand and agents, actors on the other, that gets very, very far away from the God is a hypothesis, Sean Carroll video whole thing.
Sounds a little pre-suppy to me.
It's playing with categories, and one of the things that you can then talk about is if God wants to interact with us as hypothesis generators or as agents trying to make reality differently from what it is, then the quality of that interaction isn't going to look like a hypothesis that's falsified or corroborated. Okay. That interaction is going to look very different. And you see this if you go to a science group meeting and you see the different scientists playing with each other's intuitions. It's not properly framed as what's your evidence? Like, evidence is definitely at play, but if you, for example, go to a standard biochemistry lab, they will be doing gels to look at their things, but their models will be far more sophisticated than just the gel. It almost looks like a violation of Occam's razor, except that there are all these other people having the ideas, and when they throw all the ideas together and support them from all the different disciplines, then you can start understanding how the biochemists will use just a gel and how they prepared the thing and make these really sophisticated inferences about what's going on. Okay. Nevertheless, at the group meeting, they're not just talking about evidence. They're talking about how you intuit what might be going on, what might be a good experiment to do. You're really interacting with each other's hypothesis generators.
Right.
And that interaction is totally distorted if you just go online and someone says, what's your evidence that God exists? It's like, it looks at a very small fraction of what's going on. Does that make sense?
Yeah, well, if you get down to the point, down to this, what is your evidence for God dialogue, I guess it makes sense. But here I sit with absolutely no belief or concept of God at all, or no belief of what I think your concept of God is, right? So I have absolutely no belief. So to me, if you suggest that God exists, that is a hypothesis, right? That I have to consider.
Except that Mike exists to me is not a hypothesis.
Okay. Yes.
Category mistake.
But I'm here. Okay.
There are two different ways you can be there. One is that I'm one of those people who sees everyone else around them as kind of like a bad clone of themselves. Or my role model might be a better clone of myself. But nevertheless, I always project my categories on everyone else. Okay. And so when I hear what you say to me, I'm not really hearing your intentions. I'm hearing what I would mean if I said those words with my sense of your history and so forth and so on. But that's a mode of interaction where you don't actually exist. All that exists is like my narcissistic world.
Okay.
Another kind of you existing is I give you some neurons in my brain that you get to control. You get to say how things should work. And one way to get at this is you can give me some idealizations and abstractions that characterize your view. And if I think they're wrong, I don't get to just say, nope, you're wrong, and then bring in all my understanding to say they're wrong. No, I shape my neurons, the little cluster of them that I give to you, and I say, okay, I'm going to assume that those are true somehow.
Okay.
And this gets very close to like the theist's conclusion first thinking. I'm just going to say that the abstractions and idealizations you gave to me are true somehow, and then wrestle with those and ask you questions, but give you the right to dictate what's true. That's a way to let you into my mind, I think, in a lot deeper way than most people are ever willing to do that.
Okay, that would be trying to acquire my ideas or see it from my point of view, right?
Yeah, and that's when I don't let my categories of thought completely determine everything I'm willing to consider.
Okay. Okay, but let's try to frame that with me and your God hypothesis. Okay, so how would I do that with you? How would I acquire your belief in God without believing in it? I guess I don't know.
Do you consider?
I'm struggling with where you're going here. Okay,
Luke, do you consider individual hypothesis generators to be the proper subject of a hypothesis?
You can make claims about hypothesis generators that take the frame of hypotheses, right? Okay. But that which generates the hypothesis is not itself a hypothesis.
Right.
Yeah, because I'm thinking in terms of like, how detectives will have a theory of the crime, and it's usually an individual person. And I'm wondering if an individual person or an individual entity can be the subject of a hypothesis, or if it's just classes of entities.
Are we going back to Duns Scotus with the Hycitas or whatever?
I don't know. I'm totally a raw individual when it comes to philosophy. I'm just using the tools out there in my brain cloud.
There's a very interesting question there of whether particulars exist and are different from everything else, or whether the only thing that exists truly in reality are universals. And so here's an example. In physics, the way we do physics now, photons, there are situations where two different photons are indistinguishable. Like the statistics you do with them assumes that they're indistinguishable. It's the difference between Fermi-Dirac statistics and Bose-Einstein statistics. And the ontological status of whether it's distinguishable from other photons means different math applies, and so you get different phenomena that come out of that. And so the debate, and this debate's called the problem of universals or the problem of the one and the many, it goes way back in whether or not individuals or particulars can be ontologically different from each other or indistinguishable is a really big deal, but it's like a super abstract thing that you have to work through two examples. And so a nice example is the Pauli exclusion principle for electrons. Two electrons orbiting an atom can't be in the same state. And so they have Fermi-Dirac statistics. And that means that you can do chemistry based on Fermi-Dirac statistics. On the flip side, if you're trying to model, I think, stuff like light flows in microscopes, and you start wanting to get quantum, as in you care about individual photons because you're trying to measure something really sensitive, or you're trying not to illuminate the material very much because photons can distort it, then you're dealing with, at least some of the time, Bose-Einstein statistics, and it's going to look very differently. And so it's really nice that statistics, physics, in some sense, forces us to sometimes treat universals as the only things that exist, and sometimes that particulars actually exist. That's a big prologue to, can a particular be the subject of a hypothesis? And I don't see why not, but science generally wants things to be reproducible, which means that the hypothesis has to apply to lots of runs, and each run probably uses different particulars. And so that gets kind of interesting. And then you could throw in, we only have one universe, and yet we're treating it, we're scientifically studying the one universe according to a lot of the same tools and thinking that we do with lots of runs to try to look at the various characteristics. And Lee Smolin is a physicist who thinks that it's a mistake to use the same hypothesis machinery to study the one run universe as we use to study the many run systems that we put in the lab and explore. And some of the same intuitions might be at play with evolution, although evolution has lots of runs because a lot of it is comparable. This species evolving and this species evolving, there's lots that's common between them. So you can kind of talk about the commonalities, and then you're in universals territory and not particular. That was a big answer.
Yeah.
I'll stop there.
Okay.
Well, at least I didn't ask a dumb question. No, but I'm just wondering because I just wonder if the issue between like thinking of God as a hypothesis versus a hypothesis generator. I'm just trying to think how it could be a category error. And I was just thinking in terms of how with science, you deal with a lot of it. You turn everything into an abstraction. And so in a way, you're not really dealing with individuals. But there are certain situations where we want to find out which individual who happens to be a hypothesis. And I'm assuming that you believe that all human individuals are hypothesis generators. Is that true? Okay.
I mean, barring severe mental deficits or whatever.
We develop hypotheses about the world and our experience. We call our experience the thing that affirms or refutes that hypothesis. But which isn't really scientific. But the question is, how do you affirm a hypothesis that you have generated? And it's really statistical. Once again, it boils down to really individuals can't really be included or the subject of a hypothesis because you have to form statistical conclusions based conclusions based on statistical analysis, and an N of one is never the proper way to go about doing that.
So just so you know, I'm actually a part of a reading group with a philosopher who's challenging the N of one dogma. You can have repeatability within an individual. So for example, growing up, I was taken advantage of by my peers at school because I was very repeatable. And so they could get me to think a thing, convince me that it was true, and then I would hold that it's true while they mocked me and sort of used it to screw with me. And so I was kind of sticky in that sense. But the stickiness that I stayed regular there, I think meant that they could do true science on me. Okay. It's if you change your reaction every time, then you become completely non-repeatable. And then there's how could you do science on something that's absolutely non-repeatable?
Right. Okay, so universals and particulars. There's I think everything is a particular. Everything is unique unto itself. The particulars exist, right?
Is this modal area that we're getting into when we're talking about particulars and modal logic?
No, don't.
Because you know what I'm getting at. We hear about particulars and universals from a certain camp of apologists. So
yeah, but if I have a carbon atom, a particular, right, one particular carbon atom, and that exists in time and space somewhere, right, and then I have another carbon atom that exists in time and space somewhere, and I join them together, and now I have ethane. Okay, so we have two things that are at once different and the same. There's similarities that run through them, obviously. They're basically a copy of each other. And this is the vexing thing about physics, is that we probably have 4 dozen, particulars, that are combined in different space and time locations and end up creating all of this, right? which is I don't see it as too challenging a problem to understand that there are two carbon atoms and that they have similarities, that they have some the same structure based on some internal physical laws and structure, right? Okay, so we have the two carbon atoms. Nor do I see a problem with saying that one is over here and one is over there. I think by the time when you sketch it out across space and time, that is where you end up with your particular property that makes a thing itself what it is, its identity, right? So does that make sense?
Are you asking me?
Yeah, basically.
I mean, just to say something to Scott, I have like no apologetic interests I'm not going to like steer the conversation towards something apologetics now that you've agreed with me on stuff. But my point is more, I don't even know how they do it. I haven't looked at that, so I'm just completely ignorant of that stuff. In terms of what you're saying, Mike, I think you have to look at where the people arguing about particulars versus universals think that there's a difference in one way of looking at it versus the other. So, for example, is there anything scientifically useful about tracking? It's the carbon atom that came over there, and something about the carbon atom's experience or interactions over there is going to forever matter now that it's in the ethene molecule? Or does all that history end up becoming irrelevant, and all your mathematical modeling of what's happens ignores the history? Mm-hmm. That would be a way to care about whether you basically the two carbon atoms are interchangeable. I mean, or whether the history of the given carbon atom really matters. That might be one way to get at it.
Yeah, and that's how we do science, basically, because these things are the same if we treat them the same way, put them in the same spot, and do the same things to them. They have this similarity that runs through them, along with happening to be 6 inches apart. They have their own spatial location, their own time, their own space-time identity, basically. But we could treat them the same, and that's where you get into regularity, and that's how we're able to exist at all. Without regularity, we'd be fucked. So,
at least without something that's sufficiently slowly changing.
What's that?
Regularity is strictly not required. All you need is the rate of change of things to be slow enough. So, for example, the fine structure constant might be varying in time or space. But it's just if the environment is being changed on you too constantly, then you lose your bearings.
Right. But the regularity allows us to build tools to do things with it, to do things with this knowledge, and that's why, and that's the primary purpose of science is not so much explanation as it is tool building. Of course, people could fight about that. But it's primarily to find this repeatability, to find that sameness between the two particulars, to find that universal truth, and reconstruct something in the future, which I think we'll get to when we get to intention a little bit. But so basically, I understand that the universe is this weird blend of absolute randomness and yet homogeneity running through it, right? These patterns running through it. And that allows us to be what we are. Without that, we would not, nothing, it'd be a non-starter. If we were completely random or we were completely homogeneous, we would be fucked. There has to be that tension between these two things.
So here's a question. Is there a third category beyond randomness and regularity?
I don't know what that would be. Clue.
I mean, for an example of that would be what I have started calling restriction of a substrate, which is you have, say, a CPU that is digital. I mean, basically all of them are, although analog computation is possible. A digital CPU restricts the possible electrical voltages so that they are either very low or at the maximum voltage, and the transition is nice and sharp, so that you can pretend in your software to treat everything as a 1 or a 0.
Right.
And it's by restricting the possible state space of physical reality to something much, much narrower than what physical reality can do that we can actually do things with it. And that's like a regularity that we impose right? And so our wills, you could say, although we could talk about whether wills exist or not, our wills restrict the full physical possibility to a narrow range. And it's funny. A lot of people think freedom is ability to do whatever you want. But in fact, by carefully disciplining physical reality, we can do more things than if we don't physically discipline ourselves and the reality we work with.
Right.
And so imposing a will, imposing structure on reality seems to me to be very different from just randomness or the laws of nature churn.
Yeah. So I was just reading something, and a horrible thing. I had done so much in the last 2 weeks that I forgot what I was reading, but I was reading about constraints in machines. And I think it may have been Daniel J. Nicholson, the philosopher of science, but he was talking about how like a gas engine, you constrain the pistons to go in a certain direction. So it's all about constraints. And he was, I think whoever I was reading was trying to make a comparison to biology and saying that biology is a little bit different than that it's not about those exact constraints. We think of it as a machine. So we think of this constraining vision, but life doesn't work that way. Life breaks out of that constraint path, but I think we're getting off track a little bit on that.
I mean, the nice thing there is just it's blurring the sense of a law of nature because, for example, through the even development of a given organism, you can model it as obeying different laws at different points in its development. And the laws are not exceptionless. Like we don't know of any exceptions to the Schrodinger equation, except possibly near the event horizons of black holes. Whereas there is nothing remotely as clean and law-like in biology. Nevertheless, there are tons and tons of regularities. It's just that oftentimes they have exceptions, and so you can't work in that sort of very mathematical, rigorous way that physicists love to work. You have to do something far sloppier, using far more intuition. You have to memorize far more terms, and it's just kind of a different way of interacting with reality and thinking about it, as far as I can tell.
Yeah. There's this tension. In fact, we're going to talk about it on the weather report today about fitness and what fitness is, how fitness is defined in population genetics. And in population genetics, fitness is very much that pure number or numerical mathematical idea. But in reality, it doesn't work that way. But yet you can make a estimate on a population and you can make some predictions and you can figure out certain things about the population by assuming that it does work that way and using that mathematical model, and then we get down to modeling, but back to God as a hypothesis.
Yep.
Okay. So how about I consider you as a hypothesis, right? So I haven't met you yet and somebody comes and tells me about Luke. And so you are, would you accept that as being the hypothesis of Luke, that somebody generated this hypothesis of Luke for me? Right.
I mean, yeah, so the most that person could do is pretend is like role play me and interact with you. And you would get some sort of sense of me to the extent that person's role playing is accurate. But it's always going to be far lower fidelity than if you are actually interact directly with me.
Like what we're doing right now, right? And that's basically what our minds do, and that would be the reduction. Basically, we make a reduction on something and come up with some idea of what it is, right? Like if I look at this cup right now, okay, and I'm looking at the cup and you're looking at the cup, but now we're just thinking about the cup. We're not looking at it anymore. We have reduced it in our mind. And of course, that's what our mind does, is it reduces it to possibly a little network involving a word. We love words, right? So we got a word and we've got some visual shit going on here. And we got some memories of cups and we got some ideas about cups. And so we reduce.
I'll throw another one in there. I was just listed to a Lakoff or Lakoff is the metaphors we live by, and philosophy in the flesh guy. He talked about how we have a part of our brain that does containers, like all sorts of containers. It seems to like manage all of them. So that would just be something additional fun to throw in for a cup. Like the container part of my brain is going to instantly be in operation when I see that cup.
Right. And that's the containerism, the container idea is something that we are always doing with everything we think. We end up putting it in containers. And, we think of the cosmos, and then we think, oh, outside the cosmos is God. But there's almost another container out there. And yeah, we do everything with containers. That's a very good point. I forgot that it was Lakoff that did that.
He reported on it. I'm not sure he actually did it.
Okay. There's a guy named Marvin Minsky. Are you familiar with Minsky? Yeah.
Yeah, we talked about a little bit. I've only read a few pages of his stuff, but he looked interesting.
Minsky is amazing, and he starts out with the whole idea of how brains acquire reality and start putting things together like containers and all of that stuff. But anyway, so if I have not seen you yet, I have this hypothesis. So why am I in any different relationship with the hypothesis of the Luke I've never seen than I am with God, who I do not believe in and have never seen? Why?
Yeah, there's a key difference between my attempting to tell you about God versus you having some sort of interaction with God that you can identify as something other than just hallucination or whatever else your brain is doing.
Right.
And so direct experience, a sort of very brief overview of the Bible is direct experience with God, and then stuff happens, and then Israel's at Mount Sinai, and they get the 10 words. The Decalogue is actually given directly to them. It's to everyone, not just Moses. And then the people say, okay, Moses, don't let God talk to us anymore, lest we die. And so this distancing operation happens. And then they do it again when they ask for a king. And so they really don't want to have direct interaction with God. And the prophets look forward to this thing called the New Covenant, which is everyone will have a direct interaction with God, and you'll no longer need these priestly intermediaries. And yet so much religion throughout time and culture has had priestly intermediaries because, well, oftentimes it seems like just a system of control. And so what would be the difference between me interacting in a way with God, not some sort of collective human consciousness, but actually God? I think those two can often be conflated. What society thinks of you, you can often think that's what God thinks of you. And so you'd have to figure out some way to separate those out. But ultimately, Christianity, and I think Judaism, although I need to talk about what Jews think about the whole New Covenant thing, Christianity wants everyone to have a direct interaction with God, not this indirect version that you're characterizing as hypothesis. And I agree, is a hypothesis or a model, but that's in the same domain as a hypothesis.
Okay, let's get back to, so Scott tells me, Scott is the intermediary. He tells me there's this creature called Luke that I should be doing an interview with at noon on the 20th. Okay. And I basically, Scott is a witness to Luke because Scott has talked to you, right? And so I have a certain amount of trust of Scott, and he's telling me there's a person, a human being, of which I've seen quite a few of, thousands, right? So I have no reason not to believe in Luke and believe that you're going to show up, and I trust Scott. Okay. I mean, I should be skeptical about Luke until I've actually interacted with you. But then when I've interacted with you, I have a billion new data points, right? I'm actually experiencing you, talking, reacting as a human being. And I pretty much believe, I do believe in you, Luke. I just want you to know that right now. But now if I have an intermediary, you telling me about this God thing that I have just a hypothesis of, this reductive idea of, right? This concept of, how is it wrong for me to think of what I have as a hypothesis and what you are bringing me is something that I can evaluate as to whether or not I'm going to believe you or it exists?
If I'm asking you to believe based merely on my own self-report, and what I tell you, then we're definitely in God as a hypothesis territory. But if there's a way for me to challenge you to try and interact with God somehow, and we can unpack that,
Right.
then that's an asking for you to have that direct experience yourself instead of go through me.
Okay.
And now I can be like, I mean, if you want to contribute to bleeding edge physics, you need to be instructed by a physicist, but that instruction is supposed to be sort of weak enough that you could ultimately disagree with your instructor and then go on to prove stuff that your instructor thought was impossible or wrong or whatever.
Right.
Prove, give evidence of. We can talk about theoretical versus experimental physics. So I could theoretically give you some things to try that have worked for me to interact with God, although I'm not going to claim very much in the way of concrete, obvious interactions. Most of it's more intellectual. And then you could try stuff, and you could ask 5 other people, what is the thing that you do that puts you in most closest contact with God?
Okay.
If you're going to be trained as a physicist, you're going to be trained by a number of people, not just one. And then you can try it yourself and see if you experience anything that's remotely like what was predicted. And if it doesn't work, then whatever they're claiming exists, you have no reason to believe in.
Okay. Okay. God, should I ask you to give me something that I can try?
I've only had like 2 things that are close to divine revelation. One would be that learning is like diagonalizing a matrix, which I don't think is a very standard theological thing. So when you have, let's see, it's actually, that was the way I could understand it. Diagonalizing a matrix is far better. And the idea is, how do I understand the different degrees of freedom of a system? If I push in the wrong way, then the system changes in a really complicated way. And so how can I figure out a way to push on the system in just the right way so that it changes in this far simpler manner? And then I can find out all the different ways I can poke the system to get it to exhibit various different, very specific behaviors that once I have the set of behaviors mapped out, then I've somehow broken it down into its component parts. And that's exactly what diagonalizing or finding the eigenvalues of a matrix does.
Okay.
So it's how to reduce the complexity to far simpler components that when you add them back together, they give you the complexity. So it's a way to break down and understand the system.
Right.
And so
good analogy.
So that was one of them. And another one was I know the strength of my opinions on things. And I was somehow interacting with the Pentecostal idea that you have to speak in tongues or you're a second-class Christian.
Right.
And I had an idea in my head, the idea that that's wrong. But what came over me was a really intense feeling that that's utterly and horribly wrong. To think that not speaking in tongues makes you a second-class Christian. Those are the only 2 examples where I've had any sort of super direct, what stuff came into my head which didn't seem to come from me because I have a decent sense of what I would think of. And so, I mean, think Star Trek, and you get telepathically communicated to. You have a sense that that's not you in your head, even though there's no obvious sensory perception that there's another agent there. So it's not impossible, right? But you have to get a good enough sense of yourself. And in particular, you can't be the kind of person to steal other people's ideas. Like they tell you something and all of a sudden it crystallizes in your own head and then you think that you invented it. No, you didn't. They're the ones who told you it. But if you make those mistakes of claiming attribution when it wasn't your work, then you're going to have all sorts of screwed upness in your head so that when if God were to telepathically communicate to you like Lwaxana Troy does in Star Trek, then you're going to just think it's you. So you have to somehow characterize yourself well enough so that you could detect pushes and pulls of this sort. And what I would contend is that if you think of yourself as both a hypothesis generator as well as someone who acts on the world to change it in certain ways, but the changes you do are also based on sophisticated structures of your understanding of reality. Like somebody who has an idea of how to fix democracy in America, they're not just conforming themselves to the status quo. They want to actually change it to some abstraction, right? And so they have the really smart people, at least, have some very sophisticated model of how things work and how to get from here to there. And the how to get from here to there has all sorts of hypothesis qualities to it, but oftentimes they'll have a bunch of different strategies they're willing to try. So it's like a whole set of hypotheses. Like, well, if they do this, then I'll do this. If they do this, it's like chess moves. You're going to counter all the possible moves and make democracy work. So what I would contend is that a lot of the Bible attempts to get us to think about that machinery rather than only expose the surface level of it to other people, to dig into intuitions and ideas, and to teach you to dig into intuitions and ideas. And so if God wants us to grow, I'm contending, God wants us to grow in this understanding so we can see almost the root of our thoughts, then a plausible way for God to interact with us is to poke and prod our deep thought structure and action structure.
Right.
And so how would you sort of existentially detect God doing that? Well, the easier answer is, how about exploring those thought structures and action structures? I need better terms, but hey, with another person, where you can actually see the tweaks that they made, and then you leave from that interaction. You go out of the group meeting, but you know that it was speed of sound that said to do this, and you remember that speed of sound's contribution. And when you write the science paper, you say, and speed of sound suggested I made this one critical change, and then it worked. Right? And so how do you carefully track all those attributions? And my contention is, we as humans suck at that, especially if it's a little tiny tweak. I'm probably not going to attribute you. I'm just going to say I did the paper and have first, second, third author.
Right.
But speed of sound is never going to show up, even though you causally were critical, right? What if our refusal to properly causally attribute things, and you can talk about wealth inequality and all that stuff, and how credit for work done is being attributed to Jeff Bezos that was not Jeff Bezos doing it. What if our sucking so bad at causally attributing that has made God seem non-existent to most people, because God wants to both interact with that, enhance it, correct it, and get us to not just interact with him, but each other better, because there's this wonderful, glorious creation for us to explore. You know it. I know it. A lot of people don't have that kind of joy of experiencing the world because a lot of credit gets stolen.
Okay. But still, why God? God is still a hypothesis for me that you're trying to fill this in. I mean, I'm thinking of all sorts of other reasons why it works this way, right? Like what I've written down here on a little board is at the bottom of every binge I've had as an alcoholic and an addict, I have hit this bottom right here, right? And all of a sudden, something picks me up and sends me off in a completely different direction. And it's as if it doesn't come from myself, because I know that when I was in this binge, the only thing that I could possibly do, the only power that I had, is to remain drunk and messed up, right? To go get more drugs. That was the only power I had. I had zero power. And then I was broken down to this point where I had nothing. And this thing filled in and suddenly took me off in a different direction. And that's happened to me, I think, 4 or 5 times, maybe 6 times in my life. And it also happened once, not as a result of drugs and alcohol, but as the spiritual experience that I think I told you about when I was 15. But in all these cases, the thing picked me up and set me off in a different direction. And it felt other. It felt very other. There was a time in 1976, I think it was, when I moved from northern Minnesota to Minneapolis, where I talk of three wise people that came to me, and each of them had a message, and the third one was sufficient to pick me up and move me geographically to a place where I could survive and sober up. And it was like, so I've had these compelling experiences, but it's psychology to me, right? And I understand the psychology of it. And you're telling me it's something bigger. And hypothesis, you got a hypothesis that it's, that it's some agent operating on us from through all with all of these clues and all of these experiences. But anyway, can you tell me how I would have one of these experiences? What would be the process that you would give me to go out and let God touch me? How would that work?
That just sounds so bad. But
where did God touch me on the doll? Okay, sorry.
So I would start simpler than that, and I would say, how do you do that with another person? Because a lot of interactions with other people remain very surface level, or they go down a few levels, but you don't really deeply connect.
Right.
Right. And so, what does it take to deeply connect with another person? Because what I would contend is that if we're not doing that, right, why does God want to interact with us except to help us do that? Because, and I'll give a little bit more, America is super individualistic, and everyone thinks it's just like you and God, and there's nobody else. That really matters. And one of the things they say all the time is that only God's opinion of you matters. And what they don't say is, oh, by the way, and I'm speaking with the voice of God when I tell you the proper opinion to have of yourself.
Right.
So we tend not to deeply interact with each other. And you can actually look at, say, like Putnam's Bowling Alone. The number of friends that Americans have is very low in comparison to other countries, and it's been falling over time.
Really?
And one of the results of this is you're going to distrust people, because we have an evolutionary, I kind of buy this Evo Psych explanation. We have an evolutionary instinct to distrust people who don't look and act sufficiently like us, because they're probably a threat, if for no other reason, that they're likely to be able to deceive us far better than our people in our same culture. And so the less you understand other people and the more you've been taken advantage of in life, the less you're going to trust them. And you can actually find plots of a general sociological survey question, do you trust your other, like, just average random American? And it's been trending downward over time, kind of flattened out, but at very low level. Very, very concerning to me and to other people too. And so until we can interact deeply with other people and learn not to distrust them, but to actually trust them and to build them up and let them build us up, and who I am becomes like part Mike, part Luke, and part all the other people. And it's not 100% Luke anymore. It's this tapestry. I end up being a tapestry, but the only way for me to be a tapestry is to let you contribute to my hypothesis generator and my action generator in a really deep, fundamental way. And if we're not even doing that with each other, then if God wants that as well as him to interact with us, then what is his optimal strategy for getting us to leave our individualistic, super distrustful world? Like, what should he do?
Right.
And I'll just throw one other thing, like showing up as Mount Carmel, like Jehovah can light the sacrifice on fire, the prophets of Baal can't. That's an act of raw power. Raw power is the antithesis of a trusting relationship where you are deeply interacting with these hypothesis generators and action generators. Raw power just is totalitarian and authoritarian. It is completely and utterly useless if you want deep, thriving relationships between individuals, between humans and themselves, between humans and creation, between humans and God.
So you're making an argument for divine hiddenness here, aren't you?
Kind of, yes. It is. I think it's the most compelling reason for divine hiddenness is that most of the ways that God would show up to us would be harmful for us.
Right.
Because they would reinforce terrible ideas that are so pervasive of God right now. Yeah.
Okay. If I were asked to give somebody evidence for God, here's what I would tell them to do. Okay. I would suggest that when they have a problem, something that's really emotionally distressing them or bothering them, something they cannot figure out, they've tried, the more they try, the more screwed up it gets, right? A social situation, a problem of some sort, right? I would suggest that they pray. And that when they pray, they take this thing and they make it conscious for 30 seconds or 30 to 120 seconds, right? That they make this thing constant. Then I would suggest that they let it go entirely and refuse to think about it for 3 days. Okay. Then I would suggest that after 3 days, they start looking around for the answer. And I am pretty damn sure that 70% of the time this will work, that you will find that answer. that answer will come to you from this othering source, right? This thing that seems other. Yep. You'll be driving down the street and you'll see something, or you'll think, and it's like, holy shit, that matches what I was thinking about. It locks in, there's a pattern, it all comes out, right?
Yep.
So that's one way to touch God, basically. But I'm an atheist. Why do I believe that works? Why do I do this very often in my life, right?
But other humans can take you quite a ways, right? One of the ways that other humans might be failing these days are, how do we solve the current political situation in the US? Lots of people have their ideas. I've surveyed a number of them, and they all seem doomed to failure because they're all presupposing really bad things, or refusing to presuppose at least one good thing. And so, yes, sometimes your little circle, sometimes your memory of what other people have said to you, by doing exactly, I love the process that you laid out. Sometimes doing that opens you to advice you had formerly rejected or just not thought about much, and you don't have to talk to another person. Now, if going about life might activate associative memory, you smell something or you see something that it reminds you, for example. Sometimes it could just be, it takes your brain a while to do that. But after a while of doing that, you might find that doesn't work, and you need to actually talk to people. Okay, so you do that sometimes, and then you solve some of those problems. Okay, that doesn't work. Now maybe you have to go to an expert. Okay, what if the expert doesn't work? Then you might have to consult the collective expertise and bleeding edge research. Suppose that doesn't work. Well, maybe you go to a different culture and they look at things differently, and so that's helpful. But what if that doesn't work? And at some point of doesn't work, you find out that all the humans you can connect with, historical, fictional, or present in any geography and anything, all of that has run out of gas for solving your problem. Then what?
Do it again.
But if you exhaust all of those possibilities, could it be that then if you get an answer and it doesn't seem to come from any of those sources, could it be, I mean, it could be aliens, right?
Could be.
It could be telepathic aliens, or it could be God.
It could be your brain.
True. But you have to be careful.
It could be the sum total of what you are after living for some number of years, right? Like, what you are basically is this collection, this historical collection. Like, what you are projects back into history, all the way back to prebiotic Earth, to the Big Bang. You're this collection of forces, basically, that's culminated in this pattern, this current pattern, right? And that pattern is enough or sufficient to solve most of these problems and to explain the prayer. Basically, this history is just gigantic. This accumulation of history that you have, and you happen to be a kind of an organism that keeps history around. You keep patterns in your brain. You are dynamically connected to the universe as you move through it, and you record these universal reductions on all of the particulars in your life, so that you get these patterns. And for me, that's sufficient to explain what the othering is. The othering is basically, as I'm walking through life, right, as I'm driving my car along, okay, I start out with my problem, my prayer, and then I go on this mission, right, and I start driving around. Well, there's all these things impinging on me, and these things are changing the state of me and moving my conceptual, basically my consciousness over all of these patterns of my past, combining with what's coming in the present, and suddenly it will lock in, and I will have my answer, and it will seem like the other, but the only reason it'll seem like the other is because I can't reduce it. I can't tell you how the hell it happened. I can't tell you what happened. So
anyway. So how do you tell when you've exhausted that?
The trick is, I don't know if you saw my recipe, but when I said let it go, I meant let it go. Basically, you just let the thing, you give the thing over, you give it to God, as you would in your terminology, and you give it to God as completely as you can. And if it fails and you're still struggling, then you have to give it again, and you have to keep doing that. So how would you tell that you exhaust? Well, I suppose if a truck ran over you and ended your life, I guess I would tell you something. It's like, it didn't work, right? But it doesn't always work. You don't always get these insights. You don't always get these things. I don't understand why you asked the question, how would you tell if you exhausted all the, because I don't think I've ever had the experience of having felt like I've exhausted all my resources.
There's a simple just Popperian point that if there's no way to falsify your hypothesis, then it's not scientific.
Oh no, this most certainly wouldn't be scientific.
But I'm just saying if you say that it could always come from myself or at most collective humanity, then that becomes, if that's an unfalsifiable hypothesis, then that means there's no empirical phenomenon that could possibly falsify it, which means it's just not a scientific statement. It's an assumption that you make. And then suppose that you make that assumption, then here's a question. How would God possibly falsify it or prove it wrong if it's unfalsifiable? The only way I know of is by giving you a catastrophe that you finally admit that all your resources are exhausted. And that's a really nasty way to be proven wrong, right?
Right. But the thing is, when you're the creature going through this process, right? Why do you give a shit where it comes from? Why do we have to dogmatize the belief?
For one, so I've talked to my wife's a scientist. She did biochemistry in biophysics for grad work and biochemistry for postdoctoral work. We've talked about the Nobel Prize being given to only maximally 3 people, any given prize, as very damaging to the public's conception of how science is done.
Yeah.
Right? Yeah. Not attributing properly is very damaging.
Right.
Now, it seems to me that you could find a kind of damage to not attribute God's part in things, right? And I'm not the kind of person to like thank God for everything that happens, because I actually think that there is secondary causation and there are free agents that are morally culpable. So I'm not going to thank God for everything that happens in that sense. But why would it not be interesting to know what the current collective, cognitive, and other limitations of humanity are?
Oh yeah.
And how God would have to help it grow. And that's like for your own self to recognize your own limits and then figure out how you need to be helped to grow another stage can be a very helpful thing. So why would it be bad to so carefully attribute all the contributions so that you can find out where you really need God's help? Like, that doesn't seem to be bad in any of the senses that I get atheists saying that stuff about religion is bad.
Yeah. Okay. There's the scientist me that thinks about this stuff all the time and works on it, right? The neuroscientist that works on it, right? And then there's the, down here, there's the me that's actually, got a problem, right? When I'm down here and I got a problem, the very last thing that I want to do is to start attributing dogma or attributing sources to the thing that is solving my problem. This is a position down here of pure faith. Up here, we're working on what we believe caused it. So what caused it has nothing to do with how it works, right? You Christians love the fucking dogma. Okay, you're always up here trying to interfere with what's going on down here, right? You're trying to attribute it, right? But let's
wait a second. I just heard something incredibly anti-realist and sort of the realism versus anti-realism or instrumentalism versus realism thing. You said what caused it has nothing to do with how it works. That's a kind of a weird statement.
Yeah, I shouldn't have said that. I said what caused it has nothing to do with it working for me. Basically, I don't need to know the cause of it to know that it works.
Okay.
In fact, if I have an idea that I'm carrying around about what's going to work, the chances are it's not going to work. That's just the way it works.
I would question whether that is a necessary truth of logic or physics.
I don't know.
But we often have false ideas of exactly that sort that do get in our way. So
Right.
I will agree that could be contingently so commonly or almost universally true that you think it's a necessary truth or a physical truth rather than just contingently, right? There is a lot of discussion about like, okay, so you have the laws of nature, but what caused them? Why are they that way? And there are a class of people who say those questions are meaningless, useless, right? We just trust in them. But I'm more of the camp of someone like Lee Smolin, who's like, but maybe there are answers to explore, and we could learn things if we understood why. So he has, for example, his cosmological selection. Like universes can give birth to universes. Black holes can actually be universes. And each black hole, the universe it spawns, can have slightly different laws of nature or physical constants than our own. And then that gives you something very evolution-like on a cosmological scale. But if you refuse to ever ask the question of why are the laws of nature what they are, you will never engage in that kind of exploration. And so what seems to be important is that you always just allow that you could be wrong, which is antithetical to most meanings of the term dogma. Right? Dogma is something where you cannot possibly be wrong, but you can make hypotheses about the sources of your hypotheses. You can make hypotheses about your hypothesis generator, and those hypotheses can be falsified or corroborated.
Okay.
So there's no need for dogma. The only necessary role for dogma that I can think of is that the instrument you use to explore reality has to have stable characteristics across all of the data collection. It can't formlessly change as you collect data. And so that's the one reason for absolute stability over time, is so that you can collect all the measurements that the instrument made and actually come up with sensible conclusions or hypotheses or whatever from that. Right. If your instrument is changing, if you're a fickle human being and just doing all sorts of crazy shit as you do your observations, then there's no way to collect them and analyze them. And so dogma could be a stabilization of us for a period of time so that we can make critical observations. And that, I would say, is exactly the kind of thing that Paul might have been getting at in Galatians 3 when he says that the law, as in Torah, was a prison guard, a pedagogue, teacher, and a protector. Those three things, I think, could be to form a people who are regular enough, a constant, stable enough instrument, so that they could measure the kinds of phenomena that you see discussed in the Old Testament, as in the kinds of shenanigans that humans pull over many generations and the degradation that can happen to a nation as a result of that. If there wasn't something stable enough about them in that whole process, then they couldn't possibly have made those observations. And then we today might be stuck with an inability to do historical understandings of ourselves because we're too fickle from generation to generation. And so dogma is actually needed to keep that instrument stable for long enough.
Yeah. Okay, let's see. But you believe basically that God is the other that does these things to you, right?
At least some of them. I mean, it could have been an angel, by the way, who was actually directly causally responsible for those two things that I'm pretty sure came outside of me. It doesn't have to be God. It could even have been the devil if the devil wanted to somehow make me believe false things by appearing to be God for a little while. So I have to always be very careful with how I make those attributions.
But could it be that your mind is a wonderful lens on history and the universe, that all of this,
that's another. Yep.
Right.
Yep.
Yeah. But when you're doing it, when you actually have a problem, when you're living your life and you're trying to solve, you're trying to attain some sort of spiritual connection, right? What I'm saying, and this is like old man advice, right? I'm an old man. basically you do not need any dogma to do the method, right? Like my when my atheist friends listen to this broadcast and I talk about my prayer method, they're probably all going to have a fucking bird, but but it doesn't matter if it works. You know, if the system works, it doesn't matter.
But by the way, I don't think they should have a dog, and here's why. So I tried to refine this again, but Feynman apparently said somewhere, I had a Feynman binge a long time ago. He said somewhere to have at least 7 different problems you're churning on. And you're not like actively churning on them, but your brain is somehow ready for any piece of evidence or thought or reason or anything that comes in to help you make a little bit of progress. Right?
That means he prayed 7 times.
Sorry?
He prayed 7 times.
Oh.
Yeah. Okay.
Yeah. And so, and this could be a lot longer time span than 3 or 4 days. So there's that. There's also the fact that your subconscious is super ultra powerful. And I have this like sneaking little, it's not even hypothesis. It's just a crazy idea. But I followed a little bit of the quantum computation stuff, and it's very important to leave the system undisturbed for periods of time so that it can process on its own. It can evolve forward in time with no thermal connection to the environment. And so you do stuff, you set it up a certain way, and then you don't touch it for a while. And then you measure it after a while. And that's what that's how you do, at least I think, all classes of quantum computation that we know. I mean, there are some intermediate stages, but nevertheless, you have to isolate the system from the environment for periods of time, and you need to let it evolve by itself, disconnected from the environment for a period of time. And so for that pattern, to me, is like explicit. It so pattern matches onto your little praying thing.
Yep.
And it also pattern matches onto the fact that our subconscious is super ultra powerful, and our consciousness, you'd have to check this, but I will bet if you look at things like anxiety and other what we generally call mental illnesses, that they might involve the consciousness sort of terrorizing the unconscious, as it were, and preventing it from relaxing and churning on its own without too much interference or any interference, so that it can actually figure something out. So that's my defense of what you're saying as less crazy and less theological. The theist is saying you're not being very theological or religious in saying that.
So you said something about Feynman said not to have a dog. Didn't you say something about a dog and Feynman? But
you did.
If I did, I misspoke. I was talking about Feynman saying have at least 7 problems. You have churning in the background, so that whenever you come across something interesting, right, you might feed one of them.
You definitely said you shouldn't have a dog, but we'll get into that. Was probably your subconscious intervening.
Yeah, your subconscious is probably not letting your conscious rest.
I'll have this machine transcribed after and search for dog and see what the crap I said.
Yeah, it was just a very brief thing, and then you said something about Feynman, and I was going, okay. And I've been looking up Feynman and dog on Google.
Hey, if you find something interesting, if you really find something interesting that is like super helpful to one of us, I'm going to say that's divine inspiration, that I said some random crap.
Okay. All right.
Right.
You get the win on that one, the W.
So we didn't get to a bootness again, and we're running over an hour or so. Anyway, I drew a little illustration of what I think of what you said about the subconscious. You're such a heretic. Basically, you were suggesting that your subconscious provided this information, and whereas as a hard atheist and strict naturalist, I would tell you that no, it came from God. Okay, it came from a deeper source than just your fucking brain. There is no subconscious. Well, but that's another discussion. I do not believe in the subconscious.
I mean, do you believe that there's stuff going on in your mind right now that you are not thinking about in any fashion that you could tell me immediately? Like you can't survey everything going on in your mind right now and give me a comprehensive description, can you?
Right, and that gets us into the discussion of how that very question begs the question of dualism and a homunculus, that there is no way to think about it like that. Okay, thinking about
Yes.
when you
Yes.
think about the things in your mind. Well, who the hell's thinking about the things in your mind if not your mind? If you're thinking about anyway, that is a much bigger discussion, and probably we're probably going to have to do about 20 episodes. Luke, we should do one a month at least. I don't know.
Sure.
We didn't get to a bootness to be Canadian about it. A boot.
Do you want to sort of sketch some stuff out in preparation for next time?
Sure, we can try that. On a bootness, maybe.
Yeah.
Or we get yeah. We have to avoid talking. What the hell am I doing? What's going on? I don't know what's going on. My drawing pad has gone nuts on me. So anyway, the idea of intentionality, okay, which is basically what is it? Brentano brought it back, sort of the idea of intentionality as all of our conscious states are about something, that they're about some object or something, and that discussion was that the discussion that we had talked about months ago. That
we you didn't even mention Bertano though, so
okay,
it's very brief.
You didn't think that was physically possible? I think that your question about that you think, well, some people think intentionality is breaks the back of the idea of physicalism. Okay. And I don't.
Oh yeah, it's physicalism, not anything theistic that I thought was the issue, because if there's an about layer that's not the same as the is layer, then there's a kind of very basic dualism that I'm not even sure that dualism gets to Descartes, but it does seem to be a difference in kind.
Okay. Yeah. Okay. And that actually that ties into this discussion of me not believing in the subconscious.
Mm-hmm. And, yeah, I'm not surprised.
And homunculi, plural. Everybody's got a lot of homunculi running around in their head. They just don't know it. Anyway, okay, that would be a good place to start. Maybe we could review this. So, okay, I think we can end this discussion for the day. It would be interesting to see. I'm going to run both of our discussions. I can't remember the last one. Yeah, I remember a little bit of it. I'm going to try to run both of them this weekend, probably almost back to back. Okay, we'll maybe give them a half-hour break or whatever, and then run them, and then possibly open it up to a live Saturday night at the Atheist, where they can just cut you to ribbons.
Oh, I'm so used to it that
just like the Atheist.
So my challenge for them is, if they don't say anything I haven't already heard before, they're pathetic.
Okay, good. Thank you. I will tell them. But, it's possible. Are you free Saturday night? You want to join our live panel and do some live stuff?
What time is it for you?
Either 7, 8, or 9. It doesn't matter.
Okay.
It'd be evening.
Yeah,
sort of.
So what our time is now? Are you asking our time zone?
No. 7, I'm guessing it's CST, 7, 8, or 9.
That'd be 5, 6, or 7 for you, something like that, right?
Yeah. Usually my wife gets my Saturdays, but this sounds. I can make the occasional exception, so I can check with her.
Okay.
Just spend so much time with her on Saturday that by 7, 8, or 9, she's just sick of you.
Yeah, exactly. She'll tell you to go away. Okay, that's cool. So we're going to officially end this and then stick around for a minute. So,
yeah.
Anyway, you got anything else? Any final closing thought? You heretic?
Well, actually, I came up with the God is not a hypothesis whole discussion when I was thinking about intentionality. Intentionality has actually been featuring, I think, very large in a software project that I'm working on. And the software project is it's to help a social scientist, mentor of mine, to study interdisciplinary research. And it's going to take the form of a mind mapping software, but where the mind map bubbles can contain mind maps inside themselves. So it can be recursive, and you can connect through multiple barriers, like to something deep inside. And then you can make different bubbles be data types with arbitrary many fields, and then you can look at how they interact. So it's like this sophisticated analytical tool for understanding social interactions and interactions of concepts and modeling it and so forth and so on.
Excellent.
And the connection to intentionality, I think, is an idea I've come across called a complexity barrier, which is whenever you interact with an expert, like you go to the doctor, the doctor gives you a simpler conception, like a simpler version of what the doctor thinks is going on, with the caveat that maybe it's more complicated than that. But nevertheless, they're sort of making use of this big, complicated understanding and presenting a very small fraction of it to you.
Right.
I want to try and capture that interfacing phenomenon, as well as the times where the simple interface fails. Like I want the failures and the successes to be formally tracked within the system instead of pretending that everything works just like the diagram says. Lots of people pretend everything works like the diagram, and they're wrong. And the formalism can't track the error. And so the formalism is wrong without knowing it's wrong, which is just kind of bad, I think. So a complexity barrier seems possibly related to intentionality in the sense that I have something in my mind that connects to something out there in reality, but the thing out there in reality is usually a lot more complicated than what's in my mind. And so there's this complexity barrier, I think.
Okay.
But anyway, that's just good. I don't know if you can do anything interesting with that.
That's what you're working on. Okay. Damn, I'd love to see that software, because that kind of.
Yep. Well, I have. I've learned in the past few years that I cannot be my own boss, and so I have a former submarine captain in the Navy as my COO.
Oh God.
And so we talk every other week, and we come up with a deadline, and then we talk about it. He doesn't really understand basic research, so I completely failed to hit my previous deadline, but I learned a ton about it, because creatives have a tendency just to want to wait for the idea to pop out. It could take a lot more than 3 days.
Right.
But sometimes you just got to force it, and if it's like explosive diarrhea instead of a nice idea, then you can actually learn something from that. And he helped force that to happen, but he didn't understand that I made a lot of progress in failing and analyzing my failure. So it's an interesting relationship, but it's actually really useful for him to not understand anything about basic research, really, because I have lots of people encouraging me and egging me on in the basic research world. He's the only person in the super practical world who knows how to make a $1 billion warship run. So he's forcing me to be more practical than I've been in 8 years. I used to be super practical and distrust everything ivory tower, but I've grown a lot since then. So
I could use some of that. Okay, what language are you developing in?
I'm probably going to do it in TypeScript and C# for starters.
Okay. Yeah. Okay. C# is something I've stayed away from.
It's all open source now, so it's a lot different. The thing I like about it is that it has strong typing, but a really good type inference, and some other really nice features. And I really hate languages that are weakly typed, because you can make all sorts of bugs that are just unnecessary.
Yeah. God, I love weakly typed languages. I don't know why. But
maybe you're just a duck. You know what duck typing?
Yeah, duck typing. Yeah.
So.
Yep. Anyway, okay. So we'll end it here. Goodbye, cruel world, and